realized something was wrong the day a hiring manager asked me why I hadn't mentioned my criminal record. I remember staring at my phone in complete silence because for 27 years of my life I had never been arrested, never been charged with anything, never even received more than a parking ticket. Yet somehow the company I had just interviewed with believed I was hiding a criminal past. At first I thought it was a mistake. Maybe they had confused me with someone else who had the same name. Daniel Carter isn't exactly the rarest name in America. But the woman on the phone sounded careful, the way people do when they're trying not to offend you. She said they had received a call earlier that day from someone who claimed to know me personally. Someone who said I had a history that didn't show up on background checks yet. Someone who insisted the company should be cautious before hiring me. The strange part wasn't just the accusation. The strange part was who made the call. But I didn't know that yet. All I knew was that the job offer I thought I was about to receive had quietly disappeared. It wasn't the first time that had happened either. Over the past 2 years I had applied to more jobs than I could even count. Accounting firms in Chicago, financial offices in Milwaukee, corporate departments in Indianapolis. I had polished my resume until every line was perfect. I had practiced interview answers until I could deliver them without hesitation. And every single time things seemed to be going well, something strange would happen. The interviewers would smile, shake my hand, and tell me they would be in touch soon. Sometimes they even sounded excited. A few had hinted that I was exactly the kind of candidate they were looking for. Then, suddenly, everything would go quiet. Emails would stop. Phone calls wouldn't be returned. Or I would receive a polite message saying they had decided to move forward with another candidate. At first I blamed myself. Maybe my experience wasn't strong enough. Maybe someone else interviewed better. Maybe the job market was simply more competitive than I realized. But after the 10th time, then the 20th time, then the 30th time, the pattern started to feel less like bad luck and more like something else entirely. Something I couldn't explain. The interview at Grant & Lawson Financial had felt different from the beginning. Their office sat on the 12th floor of a glass building overlooking Lake Michigan, the kind of place where everything smelled faintly like fresh coffee and expensive furniture polish. The hiring manager, Melissa Harper, greeted me with a warm handshake and a confident smile. She spent nearly an hour asking about my education, my internship experience, and the projects I had worked on during college. When we finished, she leaned back in her chair and said something that stuck in my mind the entire drive home. "Daniel, I think you'd fit really well here." Those words replayed in my head again and again as I walked to the parking garage that afternoon. For the first time in a long while, I felt like my life might finally be moving forward. That evening I told my parents the interview had gone well. They nodded politely while eating dinner at the kitchen table. My mother smiled in that distant way she often did, and my father simply said that job markets were unpredictable. Nothing about their reaction seemed unusual at the time. I went to bed feeling hopeful, already imagining what it might be like to finally move into my own apartment, to start building a life that didn't revolve around the house I had grown up in. The next morning my phone rang. It was Melissa Harper from Grant & Lawson. And within 60 seconds, everything I thought I understood about the past 2 years of my life began to unravel. The call from Melissa Harper lasted less than a minute, but it stayed in my mind for the rest of the day. Her voice sounded different from the day before, quieter and more careful. She explained that the company had received information that raised concerns and that they needed to pause the hiring process while they reviewed things internally. She did not accuse me of anything directly, but there was a hesitation in every sentence she spoke. I thanked her for calling and told her I understood, even though I did not understand anything at all. After I hung up the phone I sat in my car in the parking lot of a grocery store for almost 20 minutes, staring through the windshield without really seeing anything. The same question kept circling through my mind. How could someone claim I had a criminal record when I knew for a fact that I did not? My background checks had always come back clean. Every internship I had ever worked required one. The accounting firm where I interned during my senior year had checked as well. Nothing had ever appeared. So where had this rumor come from? I tried to tell myself it was a misunderstanding, but the longer I thought about it, the more uncomfortable the pattern of the past 2 years became. I remembered the marketing company in Milwaukee that had interviewed me for nearly 2 hours before suddenly sending a short email saying they were going in another direction. I remembered the insurance firm in Chicago where the hiring manager had sounded enthusiastic on Friday and then distant on Monday. I even remembered the small financial office near my hometown where the receptionist had seemed excited to schedule a second interview before calling back the next day sounding strangely apologetic. At the time I had assumed those things were normal parts of job searching. People always say finding your first real career takes patience. But now those memories started lining up in a way that felt impossible to ignore. Each opportunity had disappeared at the exact moment things seemed most promising. The pattern was too consistent to be random. That afternoon I opened my laptop and started reviewing every application I had sent out over the past year. My email inbox was full of polite rejection messages that all sounded almost identical. Thank you for your interest. We enjoyed learning about your experience. We have decided to move forward with other candidates. I counted them slowly, one by one, and the number surprised even me. 43 applications. 12 interviews. Not a single offer. As I sat there scrolling through the messages, I felt a quiet pressure building in my chest, the kind that comes when something in your life begins to shift from confusing to deeply unsettling. Someone had told Grant and Lawson that I had a criminal history. That meant someone had taken the time to contact them directly. That meant it was not a random rumor floating around the internet. It was a person. A specific person who knew my name, knew where I was applying, and knew exactly how to damage my chances without leaving any obvious evidence behind. The thought followed me through the rest of the evening. When I returned home, my parents were in the living room watching television, the soft glow of the screen lighting the walls of the house I had lived in since childhood. My mother asked how the interview had gone and I told her it went fine. My father nodded without looking away from the news. Nothing about the moment seemed unusual. But as I stood there listening to the quiet hum of the television, a strange realization slowly formed in the back of my mind. Whoever had made that call to Grant and Lawson knew something very specific. They knew exactly which company had interviewed me the day before. I did not sleep much that night. The thought kept circling in my head like a slow-moving storm that refused to pass. Someone had called Grant and Lawson Financial and told them something about me that was not true. Someone who knew exactly where I had interviewed. Someone who knew my full name and where I was applying for work. That detail bothered me more than anything else. Job applications are private. I never posted them online. I never talked about them publicly. The only place those details existed was inside my email inbox and in a few quiet conversations around the house. The realization sat in the back of my mind as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. By morning I had convinced myself that I needed more information before jumping to conclusions. Melissa Harper had sounded hesitant on the phone, but she had not been hostile. In fact, she had almost sounded sympathetic. That gave me a small amount of hope. Around 10 in the morning I decided to call her back. My hand hesitated for a moment before dialing the number because I knew this was the kind of conversation that could either clear everything up or make things much worse. When she answered the phone, her voice was polite but cautious. I thanked her for taking the time to speak with me again and explained that I wanted to understand exactly what had happened. There was a long pause on the line before she spoke again. She explained that companies occasionally receive calls from people who claim to have additional information about candidates. Most of the time they ignore those calls because anonymous tips are unreliable. But this one had been different. The person who called had introduced himself by name. He had claimed to be a close family member who felt morally obligated to warn the company before they made a hiring decision. Melissa said the caller sounded calm and confident, the kind of tone that makes people listen even when they do not want to believe what they are hearing. According to her, the man had told them that I had been involved in legal trouble several years ago that never appeared in official background checks. He had suggested that I had learned how to hide it and that employers should be cautious. I felt the air leave my lungs as I listened to her repeat those words. It sounded like someone had carefully designed the story to damage my reputation without giving the company anything specific they could verify. When she finished speaking, I asked the question that had been building in my mind since the previous afternoon. I asked who exactly had made the call. There was another pause, longer this time. I could almost hear her deciding how much she should say. Finally, she answered quietly. She said the man had introduced himself as Robert Carter. My father. For a moment, I did not say anything. I simply sat there holding the phone, listening to the faint background noise of an office building somewhere in downtown Chicago while my mind tried to process what I had just heard. I had expected confusion or misunderstanding. I had even expected the possibility of a stranger spreading a rumor. But I had never once considered that the person making those calls could be someone sitting at the dinner table in the house where I had grown up. I sat in silence for several seconds after Melissa said my father's name. At first I thought I had misheard her. The idea simply did not fit into the picture of reality that existed in my mind. Robert Carter was the man who taught me how to ride a bicycle in the parking lot of an old grocery store when I was 6 years old. He was the man who helped me move into my college dorm with a borrowed pickup truck and 2 plastic storage bins filled with clothes. He was the person who always told his friends that his son was studying accounting and would probably make more money than he ever did. That was the version of my father I had carried with me for most of my life. The version who quietly supported me and wanted me to succeed. But the name Melissa had just spoken belonged to a different version of that man. A version I did not recognize. I forced myself to speak calmly and asked her if she was absolutely certain about what she had heard. She said she was. She explained that the caller had not been anonymous. He had clearly introduced himself as my father and had even spelled our last name for the receptionist before being transferred to the hiring department. She apologized again and said the company had simply needed to pause the hiring process until they understood what was happening. I thanked her for being honest with me and ended the call before my voice could give away the confusion racing through my head. The house felt unusually quiet that afternoon. My parents were both at work and the living room clock ticked loudly on the wall as I sat at the kitchen table staring at my phone. I tried to remember every conversation I had ever had with my father about jobs. I remembered telling him about the interview at Grant & Lawson 2 nights earlier. I had mentioned the company name while we were eating dinner. At the time it felt like a normal conversation, the kind families have every day. Now that memory felt different. It felt like a piece of a puzzle sliding into place. My chest tightened as another realization followed immediately behind it. Grant & Lawson was not the only interview I had mentioned around the house over the past 2 years. I had talked about nearly all of them. The marketing company in Milwaukee. The insurance firm downtown. The small accounting office near the state line. Each time I came home hopeful, explaining where I had applied and how the interview went. Each time my parents had listened politely while I spoke. And each time the opportunity had disappeared shortly afterward. I stood up slowly from the kitchen table and walked through the quiet hallway toward the living room window. Outside, the street looked exactly the same as it always did. A delivery truck passed slowly. A neighbor walked his dog along the sidewalk. Everything looked ordinary. But the ordinary feeling of the house had vanished completely. In its place was a heavy realization that settled deeper with every minute. Someone had been quietly interfering with my life for 2 years. Someone who always knew exactly where I had applied before the employers even made their decisions. And the only person who had access to that information every single time was the man whose name Melissa had spoken on the phone earlier that morning. My father. I spent the rest of that afternoon sitting in the same kitchen chair, replaying the past 2 years of my life like scenes from a movie I had somehow misunderstood the first time. The more I thought about it, the more details began to surface. Small moments that had once seemed meaningless now felt strangely important. I remembered one evening nearly a year earlier when I had told my parents about an interview with a logistics company outside Milwaukee. My father had asked a few casual questions about the company name and the office location. At the time I assumed he was simply curious. Parents ask those kinds of questions. But the next morning the hiring manager had sent an email canceling the second interview we had already scheduled. I remembered the disappointment I felt that day, the quiet frustration of thinking I had done something wrong during the interview. Now that memory felt completely different. It felt like a piece of evidence I had ignored because I trusted the wrong people. Another memory followed right behind it. A small accounting firm near the state border had once called me back for what they described as a final conversation before making a decision. I had come home excited that afternoon and told my parents everything. I even showed them the email confirming the time of the call the next day. My mother had smiled politely and told me she hoped it worked out. My father had nodded while finishing his coffee. The following morning the firm canceled the meeting without explanation. At the time I told myself the position had probably been filled by someone with more experience. Now that explanation felt naive. The realization settled slowly but firmly in my mind. This had not happened once or twice. It had happened again and again. Each time I shared hopeful news about an opportunity, something unseen seemed to close the door before I could walk through it. The pattern was too consistent to ignore anymore. As evening approached I heard the familiar sound of my parents' car pulling into the driveway. The engine turned off and a moment later the front door opened. My mother walked in first carrying a grocery bag, followed by my father who placed his keys on the small wooden table near the hallway. They greeted me the same way they always did. My mother asked how my day had been. My father loosened his tie and turned on the television in the living room. Everything looked perfectly normal. But the normal feeling of the house had vanished completely for me. I watched them quietly from the kitchen, noticing small details I had never paid attention to before. The calm tone of their voices. The routine movements they had repeated thousands of times. It occurred to me that if my father really had made those calls, he had been doing it while sitting right here in this same house, only a few rooms away from me. The thought sent a cold wave of understanding through my mind. For 2 years I had believed the world outside this house was rejecting me. But now I was beginning to understand something much more unsettling. The obstacle had never been out there. It had been inside the house the entire time. I did not confront him that night. The thought crossed my mind more than once while we sat at the dinner table, the same wooden table where we had shared thousands of ordinary meals over the years. My mother talked about a sale at the grocery store and how gas prices had gone up again. My father asked if I had heard anything back from the interview. I looked at him for a moment before answering. I told him the company was still reviewing candidates. He nodded slowly and took another bite of his dinner, as if the conversation meant nothing at all. That moment told me something important. If he truly had been calling those companies, he was comfortable pretending that nothing unusual was happening. And if that was true, confronting him without proof would only lead to one thing: denial. After dinner I returned to my room and closed the door quietly behind me. The house was calm, almost peaceful, but my thoughts were moving quickly now. 4. The first time since Melissa Harper had spoken my father's name, the confusion inside my head began to shift into something clearer. If someone had been interfering with my job opportunities, I needed to understand exactly how. Guessing was no longer enough. I opened my laptop and began reviewing the details of my past applications again, but this time I looked at them differently. I paid attention to the dates of each interview and the days I had mentioned them at home. The pattern appeared almost immediately. Nearly every time I had talked about an interview at dinner, something happened within 24 hours. A cancelled meeting. A sudden rejection. A hiring manager who suddenly sounded uncomfortable on the phone. It was as if someone had been acting quickly, making calls before the companies had time to finalize their decisions. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling, letting the realization settle in slowly. Whoever was making those calls needed information first. They needed to know where I had applied and when the interviews were happening. That information only existed in a few places. My email inbox. My phone. And the conversations I had inside this house. A quiet determination began to replace the confusion I had been feeling all day. If my father truly was the person making those calls, there had to be a way to prove it. People who believe they are doing the right thing often become careless over time. They repeat patterns. They rely on routines. And for 2 years I had unknowingly given someone the exact information they needed to sabotage my chances. But now the situation had changed. Now I knew the pattern existed. And once you see a pattern clearly, you can begin to test it. The next morning I made a decision that felt simple but important. I would apply to another job. But this time I would not say a single word about it to anyone in the house. I found a small accounting firm in a nearby city and submitted my resume quietly from my laptop. When the confirmation email arrived, I closed the screen and sat back in my chair, feeling a strange mixture of nervousness and curiosity. If the pattern truly depended on the conversations that happened in this house, then this interview would unfold differently. And if someone was still making those calls behind my back, sooner or later they would reveal themselves. I waited 3 days before anything happened. During that time I told no one about the application I had submitted to the small accounting firm in Cedar Grove. I went about my routine exactly the same way I always did. I ate breakfast in the kitchen with my parents. I watched television in the evening. I answered their casual questions about job searching with vague responses that revealed nothing specific. The difference was that now I was paying attention. I was observing the small details that had once seemed unimportant. The tone of my father's voice when the subject of work came up. The way he occasionally asked which companies I had applied to recently. In the past I would have answered without thinking. Now I simply shrugged and said I was still sending out applications. On the 4th morning an email arrived from Cedar Grove Financial Services inviting me to a phone interview. I read the message twice before closing the laptop slowly. This was the moment that would test the pattern I had discovered. If no one in the house knew about the interview, then there should be no sudden rumors, no mysterious calls, and no quiet rejection the next day. The interview took place that Friday afternoon. The manager sounded friendly and interested. We spoke for nearly 40 minutes about my college projects, my internship experience, and the accounting software I had used during school. When the call ended she said something that sounded familiar but still made my heart beat faster. She said they were impressed with my background and wanted to schedule a second conversation early the following week. I thanked her and hung up the phone, then sat quietly in my room for several minutes. This time I did not tell anyone what had happened. I went downstairs for dinner and listened while my parents talked about their day. My father asked if I had heard back from any companies recently. I shook my head and said not yet. He nodded and returned to his meal. The weekend passed slowly. Part of me expected something strange to happen anyway, some unexpected message or cancellation that would prove the pattern had nothing to do with my parents at all. But nothing happened. Monday morning arrived and the second interview took place exactly as scheduled. The manager from Cedar Grove introduced me to another partner in the firm and they both seemed enthusiastic about the possibility of hiring someone early in their career. When the call ended I leaned back in my chair and let out a long breath. 2 interviews completed. No sudden rejection. No mysterious rumors. No quiet warnings from anonymous callers. For the first time in 2 years the process was unfolding normally. The realization settled over me slowly but unmistakably. The pattern only existed when I shared information inside this house. Later that evening my father asked again if I had heard from any employers. His voice sounded casual, almost routine. I looked at him across the table and felt a strange clarity settle in my mind. For 2 years I had believed the job market was simply difficult. Now I understood something very different. The opportunities had never disappeared on their own. They had been pushed away the moment the wrong person learned where I was applying. I did not say anything that night, but the certainty in my mind had already formed. The experiment had worked exactly the way I expected. When my parents did not know about the interview, nothing strange happened. No rumors appeared. No sudden rejection arrived. No uncomfortable phone calls from hiring managers asking about things that did not exist. The process moved forward the way it should have all along. That realization stayed with me over the next 2 days while I waited for Cedar Grove Financial Services to make their decision. Waiting had become familiar to me over the past 2 years, but this time the feeling was different. In the past I waited with quiet doubt, always wondering what mistake I might have made during the interview. Now I waited with a calm understanding that the outcome depended on something much simpler. Information. If no one inside the house knew about the opportunity, then no one could interfere with it. Wednesday afternoon my phone rang while I was sitting at my desk. The number on the screen belonged to Cedar Grove Financial Services. I answered calmly, though my heart was beating faster than usual. The same manager I had spoken with before greeted me warmly and explained that the partners had enjoyed both conversations. She said they believed I would be a good fit for the firm and wanted to offer me a junior accounting position starting the following month. For a moment I simply listened in silence as she explained the salary, the training schedule, and the details of the role. It felt almost unreal hearing those words after so many months of rejection. When the call ended I sat back in my chair and stared at the wall for several seconds, letting the weight of the moment settle in. The opportunity had not disappeared. No mysterious warnings had reached the company. Nothing had interfered with the process. Because no one in the house had known about it. That evening my parents and I sat down for dinner like we always did. My mother talked about work and asked if I wanted more potatoes. My father asked the same familiar question he had asked many times before. He wanted to know if I had heard back from any companies recently. I looked at him for a moment before answering. The difference this time was that I already knew the truth. I told him I was still waiting to hear something. He nodded slowly and returned to his meal, apparently satisfied with the answer. I watched him carefully during the rest of the evening. The calm expression on his face. The relaxed way he leaned back in his chair. If he truly had been making those calls for the past 2 years, he clearly believed the situation was still under control. But something had already changed. The pattern had been broken. For the first time in a long while I had moved forward without his knowledge. And the result had been exactly what should have happened all along. A real opportunity. A real job. A future that no longer depended on the walls of this house. I did not tell them about the job that night or the night after that. In fact, I waited almost a full week before saying anything at all. During those days I quietly completed the paperwork Cedar Grove Financial Services had emailed me and confirmed my start date for the following month. Each step felt calm and deliberate, like placing pieces of a life back together after realizing someone had been quietly pulling them apart. The more I thought about the past 2 years, the more clearly everything made sense. Every rejection that had confused me. Every interview that had suddenly disappeared without explanation. Every polite email that arrived right after I had shared hopeful news at the dinner table. The pattern had been there the entire time. I simply trusted the wrong people to see it. The following Sunday evening we sat down for dinner as usual. The same wooden table. The same quiet routine. My mother passed the salad bowl across the table and asked about my day. My father leaned back in his chair and asked the question he always asked. Had I heard anything from the companies I applied to? This time I did not avoid the answer. I told them that I had accepted a position with an accounting firm and would be starting in a few weeks. My mother smiled immediately and said that was wonderful news. My father looked surprised for just a moment before nodding slowly. He asked which company had made the offer. I told him Cedar Grove Financial Services. The room grew quiet for a second longer than usual. I noticed the way his expression shifted as he processed the name, as if he was searching his memory for something he had not heard before. Of course he had not heard it before. That was the entire reason the job existed in the first place. He asked when the interviews had happened. I explained that they took place earlier that week. Again he looked briefly confused. That confusion told me more than any argument ever could. For 2 years he had known exactly where to make those calls because I had unknowingly provided the information myself. This time there had been nothing for him to act on. The conversation ended quickly after that. My parents congratulated me and returned to their meal, but the atmosphere felt different now. The quiet tension that had lived inside my mind for months had finally disappeared. A few weeks later I packed my belongings into the trunk of my car and drove toward Cedar Grove early on a Monday morning. The office building was smaller than the glass tower where Grant and Lawson worked, but when I walked through the front door the feeling was completely different. No uncertainty. No hidden interference. Just a normal beginning. Sometimes people believe obstacles come from the outside world. From competition or bad luck or circumstances beyond their control. But the hardest realization of my life was learning that the thing holding me back had been much closer than I ever expected. And the moment I stopped sharing my future with the wrong person was the moment that future finally began.